Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program hosted by the Commonwealth Club of Silicon Valley. My name is Barbara Marshman. It's my pleasure to introduce Doris Kearns Goodwin, best-selling author of, most recently, Leadership in Turbulent Times. Doris is a presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author who has written books on Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon B. Johnson, the Kennedys, and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. She served as a White House fellow during President Johnson's administration and later helped him with his memoirs. In addition to covering historic leaders in politics, Doris has also worked as a sports journalist. She was the first female journalist to enter the Boston Red Sox locker room. We may get to that later. She's won numerous awards, including the prestigious Lincoln Prize. Doris was also the first historian to receive the Lincoln Leadership Prize from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. Most notably, her book, Team of Rivals, my personal favorite, was adopted for Steven Spielberg's Academy Award-winning film, Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Doris Kearns Goodwin. Thank you for being here. This is wonderful.
Thank you for having me here.
I'd like to start out. You began working on this book in 2013, I think you said, and that was before Donald Trump.
Was there ever a time before Donald Trump?
It's hard to believe, I know, and I apologize for mentioning the name right now. You obviously had the idea in mind before that. I'm curious where that came from and how it changed, if it changed, when Donald burst prominently onto the scene.
Well, what happened is each time I figure out what the subject is for my next book, it takes a period of time usually because I know I'm going to spend so much time with that person. It took me longer than it took World War II to be fought to write about Franklin and Eleanor in World War II, twice as long as the Civil War to write about Lincoln, and 7 years to write about Teddy and Taft. So the most important thing I want is to find somebody that I want to live with, to wake up with in the morning and think about when I go to bed at night. And what happened is I moved from each one of my presidents to the next one. I would always feel a little guilty because I'd have to move like all of Franklin Roosevelt's papers out of the office to make room for Lincoln, almost as if I was leaving an old boyfriend behind. So I decided this time, instead of finding a new person to spend the next 5 or 10 years with, why not bring together the 4 people that I knew best, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, and LBJ, and look at them in a different way through the lens of leadership. Something I've been interested in ever since I was in college. We used to debate when I was in college and graduate school those big questions. Where does ambition come from? Does the man make the times or the times make the man? Where are leadership traits inborn or are they developed? And it always fascinated me. It was underlying a lot of these other books, but never looked at exclusively. My own fear always about having each one of these new guys was that I always feared that in the afterlife there'd be a panel of all these presidents that I ever studied, and every single one would tell me everything I missed about them, and the first person to scream out would be Lyndon Johnson. How come those damn books on the Kennedy, on the Roosevelts and the Kennedys and the Lincoln was twice as long as me? So I figured this time I should bring him back again too, and I could figure out what I missed about the other guys by looking at them through leadership. And it's really become a great venture to do so. Clearly the title Leadership in Turbulent Times was because they all lived in turbulent times, but it's taken on a special meaning ever since Mr. Trump came on the scene. So people have said, it must be about today you're writing, isn't it? And in some ways it is, even though there's not a word about the current administration in it. It really does shine a light on what genuine leadership looked like in those great pivotal moments of our history and what the qualities were that these people had. And perhaps we don't see some of those qualities today. So it's a way of judging leaders and I think hoping that we'll find those set of qualities again in our country.
I was struck in one of the early chapters, you're talking about a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave when he was 29 years old, I believe, about his concerns about the world as it was at that time. And Doris goes, how many of you have read the book? Okay, a few. You're forgiven
it's
because
only
it's
just out.
It's just out.
I promise you, though, it's not as fat as the other one.
Yeah.
So.
I got an advance copy, so I cheated. In the midst of this summary of an eloquent speech, Doris writes this: while the ambition of the hallowed framers had been, quote, inseparably linked, unquote, with building up a constitutional government allowing the people to govern themselves, he, Lincoln, feared that in the chaos of mob-like behavior, men of the likes of an Alexander, a Caesar, or a Napoleon, he said, would likely seek distinction by boldly setting themselves, quote, to the task of pulling down. Such men of towering egos, in whom ambition is divorced from the people's best interests, were not men to lead a democracy. They were despots. Now, tell me that's not about Donald Trump on some level.
Now, the amazing thing about Abraham Lincoln, though, is here he is, only 29 years old, writing these words. And what underlay these words was that he was afraid at the time there was a lot of unlaw-like behavior going on. Abolitionists were being killed. There were lynchings in the South. And he worried that the rule of law was being undone. And he particularly worried that the scenes of the revolution were fading from people's memory, and the ideals of the revolution were thus fading. And so he called for reason to overcome passion. And he said every mother should be reading about the Declaration and the Constitution to their children in bed at night as if you were to read the Bible, because he thought it was so important. Remember, the country still seemed fragile, and indeed it was going to fall apart during the 1850s and the 60s. And there was just a sense that to keep ordinary people governing themselves, which is what he thought was so important. We didn't need kings, we didn't need queens, we didn't need dictators. We had that special thing about a country that could govern itself, but it had to abide by the laws and the Constitution, and he feared that in that mob-like behavior it wasn't. I mean, even when he was younger, at 23, he writes the most amazing handbill to announce his first run for the state legislature. And he says, every man has his peculiar ambition. Mine is to be esteemed of by my fellow man, to be worthy of their esteem. And then he says, I may not win this election. I don't have any wealthy relations to recommend me. And if I do lose, I will not be too chagrined because I'm familiar with disappointment. But then he says, but I must tell you that I'm not going to take one loss. I'm going to try and try again. In fact, I think I'll keep trying 5 or 6 times until if I lose, then it'll be so humiliating. I promise I won't try again. He's amazing.
Yeah, I'm not sure, even from all the other books, if I fully grasped how much humor and storytelling had to do with Lincoln's personality.
Oh, no question. I knew when I started to work on Lincoln that I would respect him as a great statesman. I knew that he was a good political figure and understood politics. I don't think I understood that as much as I learned, but I really wasn't aware of how much fun it would be to live with him, how the stories he told day after day after day. When he was on the circuit in Illinois as a young lawyer, they used to travel from one county courthouse to the other, and they'd fight each other during the courts during the day, and then they'd all stay in the taverns at night. And whenever anybody knew Lincoln was in town, they would come from miles around to listen to him tell stories. He could stand with his back against the fire and tell a winding tale for hour after hour after hour. And many of them were like Aesop's fables. They had a moral of the stories that he loved as a child, but most of them were just simply hilarious. My favorite story is the one that he loved to tell and that I convinced Daniel Day-Lewis and Steven Spielberg to put in the Lincoln movie, and Daniel told it in great form. As Lincoln told it, it had to do with the Revolutionary War hero Ethan Allen, who went to England right after the war to a dinner party, and they decided to embarrass him by putting a huge picture of General George Washington in the outhouse where he'd have to encounter it sooner or later. And they figured he'd be very indignant at the thought that George Washington was placed in an undignified outhouse. But he came out of the outhouse not upset at all. And they said, well, didn't you see George Washington there? Oh, yes, he said, I think it was the perfectly appropriate place for him. What do you mean, they said? Well, he said, there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington. And he had hundreds of these stories. So in the middle of a cabinet meeting, he could relax people by one of these stories. He said good humor whistled off sadness. It was better for him than a drop of whiskey. So it was the way he dealt with his melancholy was humor, and much more than I knew, and made him much more fun.
So how does one become a presidential historian?
Well, it's not something I thought about when I was 3 or 4 years old. You know, there are really some kids that you meet who they just have memorized every president. It's incredible. They can even do it backwards, which I couldn't possibly do. I think what happened is I just loved history from the time I was young. Partly it has to do with good teachers. Partly it had to do with my father, who taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games, so I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And when you're a little kid and your father listens to you for a long period of time as you recount every single play of the innings of the game that took place that afternoon, you think there's something magic about history to keep your father's attention. But it never would have been attached to presidential history, I think. When I was in college, I was interested in general history. When I went to graduate school, my PhD thesis was in Supreme Court history, which might have been relevant today. But I then got this White House fellowship when I was in graduate school to go and work in Lyndon Johnson's White House. And it was a strange tale in itself, which is that when I got the fellowship, everything was fine. I got to dance at the White House with my fellows, and he danced with me, not that peculiar. There were only 3 women out of the 16 White House fellows. But as he twirled me around the floor, he whispered that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House, but it was not to be that simple, for in the months leading up to my selection, like many young people, I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement and had written an article with a friend of mine, which we'd sent to the New Republic against Lyndon Johnson, but we hadn't heard anything until suddenly, several days after the dance, it appears in the New Republic. And the title was How to Remove Lyndon Johnson from Power. So I was certain he would kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. But then I wasn't assigned directly to him in the White House. I was still too toxic, I think, for that. So I went to the Labor Department, had an extraordinary, wonderful boss there, the Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz. And then in 1968, Lyndon Johnson decided he wasn't going to run for the presidency anymore. And he announced that on March 31st. And then a few days later, he called me up. He said, okay, you said I should be removed. I've now removed myself. Now you have to come and work for me. So I did end up working for him that last 9 months of his presidency, and then accompanying him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs. And it was that experience, I think, of being able to talk to him. He was very sad in those last years. He knew the Vietnam War had cut his legacy in two, but I was lucky enough to be working on the civil rights chapters of his memoirs and the Great Society part. And there he was extraordinary. I mean, you look at it now, 50 years later, and you think about civil rights, ending segregation in the South, voting rights, providing that precious right to vote to African Americans, fair housing, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, immigration reform, PBS, NPR, Head Start. It's an extraordinary record. And luckily I was able to talk to him about that part of it, even as I heard the sadness in his voice about knowing that would he be remembered for that or would he be remembered for Vietnam. And that experience just, I think, fired within me the drive to understand, after I went from one president to the next, each one empathetically rather than just judging them from the outside in. So I'll be forever grateful to him for really having shaped my desire to be a presidential historian.
And you are, unlike, I would dare to say, many historians who are brilliant, you are a storyteller. You really weave a story beautifully. How did that come about?
Probably partly, as I think, being Irish. I think the Irish like to tell stories.
Yes.
And I think, you know, it's interesting. Somebody said to Lincoln, why do you tell so many stories? And it wasn't just the stories he told on the circuit. If you look at his speeches, many of them are filled with stories about how we got where we are, where we were at that moment, and where we needed to go. He said that people need stories with beginnings and middles and ends more than they do facts and figures. They remember them. So I don't know. I think part of it had to do with the fact that when I was young, my mother had had rheumatic fever as a child, and she suffered from a series of heart attacks when I was young and died when I was 15. But when I was little, I always was asking her to tell stories about the days when she was young, because I thought if she would talk about the days when she was young and healthy before her illness set in, her mind would control her body. and then she would feel like a young girl again. So I was constantly saying to her, Mom, tell me stories about the days when you were young. I don't think I realized how peculiar that was until I had my own 3 boys who never once said to me, Mom, tell us stories about the days when you were young. But somehow storytelling became part of my experience with both my mother and father. Yeah. And then it just becomes part of the way you think, in a certain sense. You want to know where one thing goes to another.
Yeah, that's great. Your stories about Lyndon Johnson, naturally, affection comes through. You wanted to work for the man. You thought a lot of him. Reading your writing about him, even though you are totally right about the Vietnam War and all of the problems that caused, one gets a much more positive picture of Lyndon Johnson from this than many of his other biographers who focus on the, let's say, the bullying part of his nature, the getting things done by sandbagging people more than bringing him on a team.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because certainly his force was part of what persuaded people. I mean, even the way he stood when he talked to you was, he stood so close you could hardly breathe. And you see those pictures of him, shaking his hand at somebody. But what I learned, not just in talking to him, but listening to the tapes, those tapes that were taken are extraordinary, where you see a much more master strategist at work. What happened is, when he was talking to anyone in his Oval Office that he thought was important, he would press a button, and then it was recorded. So you hear how he persuaded senators to do something, and it was much more subtle. I think that's where I got the feeling that than just the idea that he was using force. Sure, he traded things with people. When you listen to him talk to Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader, who was necessary if they were going to break the filibuster for the Civil Rights Act, because the Democratic senators in the South were all going to support the filibuster. And at first he does, what would you like, Everett, in Illinois? Anything you want, ambassadorships. I'll come to Springfield, a postmastership in Peoria. But then eventually he understands that Dirksen has his own desires for something larger than himself, that ambition is not just for that. So he says to him, Everett, 99 years from now, the NAACP will fly your banner if you come with me on this bill and bring some Republicans. And then finally, the pièce de résistance. Everett, you come with me on this bill, and 200 years from now, school children will know only 2 names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist? And then you hear him on these tapes. He's calling somebody at 9 a.m., at 2 a.m. He says to the senator, I hope I didn't wake you. Oh, no, I was looking at the ceiling hoping my president would call.
Speaking of hope, you have said in other conversations that one of your reasons for writing this book is to give readers hope that because others have come through terrible times. And I tend to, even growing up, I graduated from college in 1970, so I was all through the Vietnam War. I was aware at the time that it was turbulent, but it always interests me to see it in history as even more so. These 4 presidents all confronted those kinds of times. How do you compare this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important for us, and this is where history can give us some sort of assurance, is we do feel, I think, sometimes people will say to me, are we in the worst of times? And the answer is, these are not the worst of times. I mean, imagine Lincoln coming into office and the country has split in 2. 600,000 people are about to die. He said if he had ever known what he would face when he came in, he would not be sure he could have lived through it. Or imagine even Teddy Roosevelt coming in when the struggles during the Industrial Revolution between the working class and the capitalists, between the rich and the poor, were much more intense than they are with our global revolution and technological revolution today. And there was really an air almost that there might be some violence. There were nationwide strikes, that revolution was in the air. And then FDR, of course, comes in when he's afraid the whole house of cards might collapse. The Depression is at absolute rock bottom. People are taking their money out of the banks. The banking system is collapsing. And there was a feeling when JFK dies and LBJ takes over, who knew what the conspiracy was that had brought about those deaths? And also the civil rights movement had heated up. The bills were stuck in the Senate. And there was a feeling that the racial tension might heat up even more. And yet somehow, with the right leader in the right place at the right time, we came through those struggles. And the citizens were active in all those cases. The anti-slavery movement under Lincoln, the progressive movement under Teddy and Franklin, and then the civil rights movement under Lincoln. So I think what we're feeling today is that things are so chaotic right now that there's a feeling of a lost mooring. And there's a sense that we are in unprecedented times with breaking news one day after another. There's a sense that the country is lurching from one place to another, that the rule of law is at issue, and there isn't the leadership that's helping us to go through it. I think there are signs now that people can feel a sense that we're moving in the right direction. There's an awakening of citizen activism. There's more women running for office than ever before, and running for the first time. And there's an interest in politics again, and there's a sense, I think, of taking hold. I think the reason it feels so troubling is that when people feel this is now become the norm, we have to get used to this, used to these people screaming at each other, used to one thing being said one day and another thing being said another, used to a scandal coming one day after another. This is what we're leaving to our children. I promise you what history will tell you is it will not stay this way. Not if the citizens get active. Something will change. We have to heal the divisions that are in our country. They were there before Mr. Trump. I mean, to be fair to him, we've already had a polarized country. I mean, we couldn't get things through on a bipartisan basis in the Congress for a period of time. And there's a cultural division in the country. There's a feeling between rural and city areas. There's a feeling of people being left behind. There's a feeling difference about immigration. There's a lot of struggles. But those struggles we had before, eventually with leadership and eventually with citizen activism, we were able to do this. FDR said, problems created by man can be solved by man. And I think we just have to believe this. When we're feeling so troubled right now, it's when we feel, what can we do about this? There are things to do. First of all, we can vote. I mean, the most important, simplest thing in the whole world. And I mean, eventually, I think we just have to figure out ways that people should get registered at 18. We should make it much easier to vote. We should have a holiday on voting. In a democracy, voting is essential. And we're saying a lot of things about what we want to change in the country, and it will mean nothing unless people go to the polls. But we'll see what happens. We'll see whether or not the country sustains this kind of unbroken spirit that we have right now. We'll know soon. We'll know soon.
Yeah. It's a little bit different in that in the 4 studies you just did, the presidents coming in wanted to overcome the chaos. And this president is exacerbating the chaos.
Well, you know, I think the interesting thing that happened in the 2016 election was that because politics seemed broken in Washington, in that Republican Party especially, anyone with political experience was undone by the outsider coming in. And it's a troubling sign, I think, in our political world right now that political experience is downgraded. It just shows that the politicians didn't earn the honor that they should have. But it's very hard to be president anyway, no matter what kind of experience you've had. And then if you come in without real, not just political experience, but without real leadership experience. I mean, I can imagine a businessman who had hundreds of thousands of employees, had customers and shareholders, had learned many of the leadership strengths that these other people have. But in a certain sense, President Trump had come in without that huge, even leadership experience. He had branded himself. He's done it well again while he's been there. But without that experience, then things do tend to become even more chaotic. And then you have the feeling that there's an exacerbating of the divisions and stoking the base rather than expanding it. Normally, a president comes in and they want to expand their base and they want to unify the country. And none of the tendency, it seems, has been toward that in these last times. I just keep waiting for him to grow in office because that's what all my leaders did, that they somehow, when they got in there, they all had to grow and learn from adversity. They had to learn from their mistakes. They had to acknowledge the mistakes first in order to be able to learn from them. And that process, I just keep waiting for it to happen.
Yes, we all do.
But it requires humility. I mean, that's the thing. In order to it really does. I mean, in a very positive sense. I mean, it requires your willingness to know that I don't know as much as I need to know. I'm going to make mistakes, and I'm going to learn from them. Teddy Roosevelt learned when he first got into the state legislature. I mean, he like Trump, loved to be in the center of attention. He was a great, colorful character. I mean, they said about him that he wanted to be the baby at the baptism and the bride at the wedding and the corpse at the funeral. And so you could see him as somebody who would be surrounded. But once he got into the state legislature, he learned, because he started with real blistering language. He would, when somebody opposed him, he would yell and pound his desk, and he made headlines because he would be great in today's Twitter world. I mean, he would know how, he had all these sayings: speak softly and carry a big stick, don't hit until you have to, but then hit hard. He even gave Maxwell House the slogan, good to the very last drop. So I can see him today. Actually, he would be a good candidate in today's world. But he did learn. He said he had developed a swelled head, and he couldn't get anything done in the legislature, so he finally moderated his histrionic language, and he learned to cooperate with the other side of the aisle. I mean, FDR became a much more empathetic person, a much more seasoned politician after his polio, when the humility was thrust upon him by having to learn over and over again how to at least appear to be walking. And it took year after year of him to just strengthen his upper body muscles so that he could get in and out of his wheelchair. He was actually, when he was young, in the early days, rather, of the polio, he would be put down on the carpet of his library floor from the wheelchair and then crawl around the floor for hours just to strengthen his back. And he said, if you are in a stage of your life where all you want to do for 2 years is move your big toe, you learn humility that way. So he became much more warm-hearted, much more understanding of other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand. So through loss, all of my guys, as I sometimes call them, became wiser and stronger. And the difficulty for President Trump is he had said at one point that he had the very, very best temperament of anyone who'd run for president because he never lost, because he always won. And that just goes against the grain of history. Losing helps people to learn how to deal with failure and go and get stronger.
We were talking earlier, you mentioned along the lines of encouraging hope that that two of the presidents you profiled came from very, poor backgrounds. Lincoln and Johnson both grew up in really horrific circumstances, even for the time. It seems today that we're not getting the same caliber of people from those circumstances or from the rich, would be perhaps a Donald Trump example. Is that unfair? Is it only in the light of history that we see people as grand, or do you see a difference?
Well, I hadn't thought about that question, but I think when you look at the 19th century, going into public life was considered one of the best ambitions for a young man. I mean, anyone who wants to be a leader in any field, ambition has to come from somewhere. And in Lincoln's time, especially if you came from a poor background, but even if not, I mean, looking at wanting to be in public life, it was exciting. Sporting events were not around as much, so the debates that you would have in politics were considered like sporting events. When Lincoln and Douglas debated one another, they went on for 6 hours, and the audience would be part of them screaming in, hit him again, harder, harder. Politics was everybody's sport. And that was a wonderful thing in a way, in a democracy that it was. And then as we've moved away from that and other things entertain people, it used to be there'd be great parades, there would be candlelights, there would be these constant talks about politics. And it's happened during periods of our time. Obviously, in the 1850s and 60s, that was so. At the turn of the 20s, and then after the late part of the 19th century, it was less so, and people went more back into private life. There's always cycles in this whole thing after the Civil War. And then the progressive era comes at the turn of the 20th century, and being in public life seemed the most exciting thing to be. And you get a group of people who then have the right ambitions to want to be in public life. And then again, during the New Deal, I think during the 60s, it was a time when the great public issues cut across private lives, and so many young people wanted to be caught up in public life. And then I think what's happened in these later years is that people have, maybe for some good reasons, they know that their private lives will be exposed in ways that they weren't before. They know they're going to have to raise money. The amount of time that a public official has to spend in raising money, I mean, it's absolutely the poison in our system. We have to do something about it, and until we do, maybe we won't be getting the best people in public life. So I think maybe there's a sense of, and then if the politicians' reputations go down because they can't get along together and things aren't working well, then you still have less people. That's why it's encouraging that whatever's happening today, it does seem like when you look at the marches, when you look at the, as I say, numbers of young people who are interested in politics, and you look at the numbers of people who never were in politics before now running, you know, having been doctors or nurses or lawyers, I think it's a wonderful thing, and I've got to hope that if something comes out of the turmoil we're feeling, and people feel we have to go back into our political system to make it better, then it's a good thing. That's the hope I have.
Well, we recently had a president who came from at least an ordinary background, President Obama. Any thoughts about how history and historians will judge his presidency?
Well, it normally takes a while, you know, to be able to judge any president because you have to put in context what they were given to deal with and how they dealt with the challenges. And you have to get the memoirs that'll come out and the stories that will be written and the papers that will be opened. I mean, I think we can right now see that there's an appreciation for the decency and the civility and the lack of scandal and the way that President Obama comported himself. I think historians will have to figure out later, could he have done more to bring the Congress over to his side, or was it true that when Mitch McConnell said, I want my major goal to be him out of office in 4 years, that it wouldn't have been possible? I mean, I think the difficulty was in some ways that he had made a promise to his wife and children, and it was the right promise to make as a human being, that he would have dinner with them every night when he could, if he didn't have another social obligation. If you're Lyndon Johnson, you're having dinner with the congressman every night. You're bringing them over to the White House. That's your life. And that will be a question. Could more have been done? Clearly, there'll be questions about Syria. I did a exit interview for Vanity Fair with President Obama, and he was really quite remarkable in it, in that I asked him about Syria. He said, no, I asked him what his biggest regret was, and he said it would be Syria and what happened to the refugees. Not that he was presented with two alternatives and he chose the wrong one, but that he wasn't sure maybe there was some other creative alternative that he hadn't thought through. You know, and then he said, maybe if I had the brilliance of a Churchill, or if I had the wizardry of a Lyndon Johnson with the Congress, or the charm of an FDR, maybe I could have done better. It was a very honest thing to say. I mean, I was lucky enough to get to know him because he was reading Team of Rivals when he was running for the office against Hillary Clinton. And he called me one day on my cell phone, and I just hear this person saying, hello, this is Barack Obama. I'm reading Team of Rivals, and we have to talk. So I went to the Senate office building, and we talked about Lincoln's amazing emotional intelligence. He was fascinated with how he could forget people that had hurt him in the past. Particularly, we talked about one incident where Stanton, who becomes his second war secretary, and he had been in a case together in the 1850s, and Stanton had absolutely humiliated Lincoln in the case. He had taken one look at him when they were supposed to work together. He saw a big stain on his shirt, his hair was disheveled, his trousers too short for his long legs, and he turned to his partner, he said, we have to lose this long-armed ape, he'll hurt our cause. Lincoln was so dejected by that, but instead of leaving the case, he listened to Stanton, who was so brilliant doing the case, and then he vowed that he would become an even better lawyer. But most importantly, when Stanton actually, when Lincoln is in the presidency, his first Secretary of War has resigned, and everybody says, Stanton's the best man for the job, he's bully, he's intense, he'll be difficult, and he's able to forget that earlier resentment. And I talked about that with President Obama, then Mr. Obama. And then, of course, once he won the nomination over Hillary, somebody came to him and said, would you really be willing to put into your inner circle someone who was a chief rival, even if his or her spouse were an occasional pain in the butt? And then he quoted Lincoln. He said, these are the strongest and most able people in the country. The country's in peril. I will do it. And then, of course, he made her his Secretary of State. And then I was at a party because I was there for NBC to cover the inauguration, and Hillary was at the party the night before, and she came up to me teasingly, and she said, you're responsible for my being Secretary of State. Not me, but Abraham Lincoln.
Well, I have here a question. We may actually have to ask the person to asked it to raise his or her hand. Please tell the story about LBJ and Joseph Califano crossing the Pedernales River. Pedernales, of course, river, at his ranch in his amphibious vehicle. You told it when I took your course
Oh my God.
on the American presidency at Harvard in 1969.
Wow.
Would the questioner like to raise?
Oh, yay. Where is where is it? Can you see?
No.
Well, welcome back. You've done well. Yeah, in fact, what the story is, I just come back from working with Lyndon Johnson when I started teaching this course on the presidency at Harvard. So the students were hopefully regaled with the stories that were so fresh in my mind. What happened is that, and this actually happened to me, it happened to Joe Califano as well, but you'd get in a car with Lyndon Johnson, and you were on a hill, and then the lake would be down there below, and you didn't know that this is what was going to happen, but he would have the Secret Service say to you, be careful, Mr. President, the brakes aren't so good in the car. He says, oh, don't worry. And then you go down the hill, and you go into the water. And so I didn't get scared for some reason. I don't know why, because I figure I'm with the president. And then he got mad at me. He said, what's the matter with you Harvard people? Don't you have enough, intelligence to get scared? You're supposed to scream. And so then they did a movie about All the Way, the play that was on Broadway,
Yes.
where Bryan Cranston played LBJ. And I told that story to them. So they had a scene where Hubert Humphrey was in this amphibious car with him. So anyway, there were many adventures with Lyndon Johnson, and I'm so glad to, once this is over, come and say hello so I can see how you've turned out.
A question from a longtime follower of history, obviously. Tim Russett has been gone for 10 years. That seems hard to imagine. I know you were close friends and colleagues. What is your warmest memory of your times together?
Well, I think he loved public life so much. He wasn't judging the politicians. He just wanted to get them to talk. And he really did become a friend. I spoke at his memorial service. But the thing that I remember most right now is that before he died, we were talking about how could journalists cover presidential candidates better than they were doing then. He felt right then that too much was being taken about who says what at a debate. These debates are sort of stupid anyway in terms of what goes on. Who raises the most money? Who makes promises that they may not be able to keep? And instead, we talked about what if we were to outlay, because this is what I was thinking about even then, I now realize, a series of leadership traits that you would want in a person who was going to be the president. You would want humility, you'd want empathy, you'd want resilience, you'd want their ability to communicate and keep their word to people. You'd want them to be able to control their negative emotions. You'd want them to be able to have an ambition that goes beyond themselves to something larger than themselves. And we thought about having sort of like an index of these things and judging the candidates. With research, a journalist could find out, not just in a big magazine article, but they'd all come from somewhere. They'd been a governor, a senator, a mayor, or they'd been even a businessman, and you could look at how did they treat their staffs, what kind of a team did they create? Did they allow people who were strong-minded to speak up? Did they make that team go for a common purpose? And if we could talk about that in terms of the campaign and understand temperament, how much more important that would have been, especially in this 2016 election. And in fact, one of the funniest things I know we talked about was the importance, and I think this was so true of Tim. He loved his Buffalo Bills. He loved to replenish his energies by sports and by thinking about other things than the work he was doing. And one of the categories that I have found out in my leaders is the importance for them in the midst of all their anxiety to find ways to relax, find time to think and replenish their energies, something that so many of us think is impossible today in the 24/7 world. I know so many young people who are taking their phones with them even on vacations, who feel they can't be out of touch because they're so important that they have to be in touch all the time. Well, my guys, they were doing pretty important things, Civil War, Depression, World War II, and they all found time to relax. It's one of my funniest parts of the pleasure in working on the book. Lincoln actually went to the theater more than 100 times during the Civil War. He said when the lights came down and a Shakespeare play came on, for a few precious hours he could forget the war that was raging. And of course, his greatest form of relaxation, as we said, was his funny storytelling ability. Teddy Roosevelt actually spent 2 hours every afternoon in physical exercise. It could be a wrestling match, a boxing match, or it could be what he liked the best, a hike in the wooded cliffs of Rock Creek Park. And he made a simple rule when he took companions with him that you couldn't go around any obstacle. You had to go through it. You had to move point to point. So if you came to a rock, you had to climb it. You had to go down it. So they talk about companions falling by the wayside with him on each of these ridiculous walks. But the best person left the story was the French ambassador. He said he arrived at the White House in a silk vest, as if they were to walk in the Champs-Élysées, and he finds himself in the middle of the woods, hating every minute of it. Finally, they come to a stream, and he says, "Thank God it's over." And then he said, "Judge of my horror, as I saw the president unbutton his clothes and say, well, this is an obstacle, we can't go around it, so we don't want to get our things wet. So I, too, for the honor of France, took off my clothes. However, I left on my lavender kid gloves. It would be most embarrassing if we should meet ladies on the other side if I didn't have any gloves." And then FDR has a cocktail hour every night during World War II where the rule was, like Lincoln, you couldn't talk about the war. You could relax and imagine yourself just talking about gossip and movies and books that were read. And after a while, this cocktail hour mattered so much to him that he wanted the people who would be at the cocktail hour to actually live on the second floor of the White House to be ready for the cocktail hour. So his foreign policy guy, Harry Hopkins, comes for dinner one night, sleeps over, never leaves till the war comes to an end. His secretary, Missy LeHand, lives with the family in the White House. Lorena Hickok, a friend of Eleanor's, has a bedroom next to Eleanor, and the great Winston Churchill comes and spends weeks at a time in a bedroom diagonally across from Roosevelt's. So when I was working on the book, I became obsessed with the thought of all these people in their bathrobes at night in the second floor corridor, what great conversations they must have had, and wishing when I'd been up there when I was 24 with LBJ, but I'd never thought of asking, where did Churchill sleep? Where was Franklin? Where was Eleanor? Well, it so happened I was telling this on a radio program in Washington when Hillary was in the White House, and she was listening, so she promptly called me up at the radio station and invited me to sleep overnight in the White House. She said we could then wander the corridor together and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So she followed up with an invitation to a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2 a.m., the president, Mrs. Clinton, my husband, and I, with my map in hand, went through every room and figured out, yes, Chelsea Clinton is sleeping where Harry Hopkins was, the Clintons are sleeping where FDR was, and we were sleeping in Winston Churchill's bedroom. No way I could sleep. He was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his ever-present cigar. So anyway, they all found, except for LBJ, he never really could unwind, and that hurt his ability to keep replenishing his energy. Even at the ranch, he had a swimming pool that you presumably could swim in, except that it was so filled with a series of floating rafts with floating memo pads and floating telephones on it that you couldn't do anything except stand there.
No, thank you. Here's another, no, I guess Kevin, the writer of this question, may not know you, but he says, as a current suffering Dodger fan, with a father and, yes, I see that, a father approaching the end of his life, what is your most fond memory of your father and the Dodgers from your childhood?
Well, you know, when I was a little girl, the Dodgers would almost always lose before they finally won one World Series in 1955. And the weirdest thing is that in some ways the most intense memory is when the Dodgers lost to the Giants in this playoff series when Ralph Branca hit this home run at the last minute to undo the Dodgers. And my father was so wonderful to me when he came home that night because I was so distraught. There was a butcher shop around the corner, and they were all Giant fans. And they used to call me Rag Mop because my hair was kind of messy. And I wouldn't even go to I wouldn't even go into the butcher shop for days because I felt so terrible about the Dodgers having lost in this dramatic moment until they finally sent me my first set of flowers, and it said, "Dear Rag Mop, please come back. We miss you." But I remember when my father came home that night just telling me what I remember I had to tell my children, don't worry, we'll do it next year. When they took the Dodgers away from us, Walter O'Malley ripping to Los Angeles, and eventually I went to Harvard and became an equally irrational Red Sox fan. And we have now had season tickets for more than 35 years. And when my kids were little, in 1986 at the last minute. The Red Sox lost the World Series when the ball went through Bill Buckner's legs, and my kids saw me crying, and they said, "What's the matter? Don't worry, Mom, they'll win next year." They had no idea that it might be from 1918 until so I didn't tell them. I just said, "Right," just what my father said. We'll win next year.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. Would you tell us about LBJ learning humility early in his presidency?
Well, the interesting thing, it wasn't so much early in his presidency. I think the most important thing he learned early on was empathy. He took a year off from college, and he taught at this little Mexican-American school where he saw the pain of prejudice, he said, on the faces of the kids. And he did everything he could for them. He used part of his first salary to buy sporting equipment, which they had none. He was the principal, he was the teacher, he was the band leader, he was everything in the school. And the kids adored him because he said he just wanted to build in them the fire of ambition, the hope that they could be something in their lives. And the most extraordinary thing is, in 1965, when he went to the joint session of Congress after the demonstrations in Selma to call for a Voting Rights Act, he gave a speech that I'm so proud to say my husband, who just died this past May, wrote that speech, and it is an incredible speech. He had only that day to write the speech because Lyndon Johnson had just decided the night before that he wanted to give it on Monday night. And it starts with history and fate meet at a certain time at a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. And then he talks about it's not a Negro problem, it's not a white problem, it's an American problem. And then he talks about the fact that it may take a long time for us to get where we want, and then he takes the anthem of the civil rights movement, but we shall overcome. But then there's an incredible passage in there that goes back to this moment when he was the only time Lyndon Johnson called my husband up in the middle of that day, because he knew he had to write this speech in such short order. He said, "Would you talk about my experience in Cotulla?" And he talked to Dick, my husband, about it. And in that speech, he says that when I was young, I taught at this Mexican-American school, and I never thought then, when I looked at those kids, that I would have the power now to do something about that pain of prejudice that were on their faces for their sons and daughters. And let me tell you, I intend to use that power. It was so powerful. It was an extraordinary speech, and 6 weeks later, the Voting Rights Act passes. In fact, one of the things that I try to understand in the leadership book is when these different kinds of qualities, some are inborn. Lincoln had empathy from the time he was a child. Even when he was young, other kids would throw hot coals on turtles just to watch them wriggle. And he would go to them and say, "That's wrong. There's pain in that turtle." Or he was walking home one time with a group of friends, and he saw a person who was drunk having fallen by the side of the road. And everybody walked by, and he went back and picked him up and had to carry him home because he felt the pain of the man. Mm-hmm. But others had to develop it. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt said when he first went into office at the age of 23, he just went in for the adventure of politics. He wasn't doing it to make lives better. But then through political experience, he saw the decrepit tenements around him. He saw what it was like when he was police commissioner to walk in the midst of the nights in those terrible houses people were living in. He saw children working child labor in factories. He was a soldier, and he was with fellow soldiers, and he developed then a desire to better the lives of others. So I think how these qualities develop, there was a certain humility, I suspect, that Johnson finally learned because of the war in Vietnam, and knowing that he might not, as I said earlier, have the legacy he hoped. But that wasn't one of his natural qualities, humility.
It's neat. You mentioned reading the Declaration and Constitution to your children. What's your opinion of the Federalist Papers? They're very relevant now.
Obviously, it's so right in the question. I mean, the Federalist Papers set up the whole checks and balances system that has created our republic. And what we've seen happening in this last, not even just now, but in these last years, is the presidency having gained more and more power. And it's so important that those other institutions are there to provide a check and balance. But when you've got, as we do now, one party that's controlling the presidency and the Congress, and perhaps now the Supreme Court, then I think the Federalist characters would be worrying about where is the check going to come from. Well, the ultimate check is the American people. I mean, everybody has to answer to the American people. I mean, one of the things that, it's true, that's right. And One of the things that Abraham Lincoln said is that with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So he said the people who create public sentiment have more power even than the people who make the laws, because they are the foundation for which the lawmakers have to answer. In the end, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt talked of himself as a steward of the American people. One of the cases that I deal with at the end of the book, I chose pivotal moments in each one of the presidents' lives so that when they got to be president, after I go through at the beginning, when they're young, they run for the first time, I wanted to show people that they struggled the way. I was talking to a kid in college, and he said, how can I ever be one of those guys? They're on Mount Rushmore. So I decided I'd start when they were in their 20s, when they were going to fail, when they're going to show struggle and disappointment, so that you could identify with them. Their struggles are ours. And then I put them all through. No, I didn't put them through them. They themselves went through these terrible adversities. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt lost his wife and his mother on the same day in the same house. His wife died in childbirth. His mother had come to take care of her, and she got typhoid fever, and the same day they died. And he was so depressed he went to the Badlands for 2 years to try and recover from that. And it was there, however, that he found what he would be in many ways. He found that conservation love that would be forever his legacy, and he found himself a larger person in a way, a Westerner as well as an Easterner. FDR obviously had his polio. And LBJ actually had been accumulating power all along, but then he was majority leader of the Senate, and there was not a great purpose to which that power had been put, despite that early progressive New Deal tradition and the Cthulhu experience. And then he had a massive heart attack in 1955, and he came out of his depression, said, what if I died now? How would I be remembered? And that's the important thing for all of these people. It's a certain moment, as I think I was saying, that ambition for self becomes ambition for something larger. But anyway, then in the end, I just go to these pivotal moments, and the coal strike is one for Teddy, a very formidable strike where the miners were on strike for 6 months, and coal couldn't get to New England. And then he decided, okay, there's labor and there's management, but I am the steward of the people, and I'm going to bring the people to bear on this strike. And it was the first time he'd ever called labor and management. No one had ever done that before into the White House, and he arbitrated the strike eventually, which was something that had never been done. But he said, in the end, these leaders are responsible to the people, and we are the people. So we have the responsibility right now to make things better.
Well, here's one of the challenges of doing that. The value of truth seems to be being diminished. Can that be undone?
It is a very serious problem right now. I mean, and again, the idea that words matter, the idea that things you say can be taken back the next day, or that you just repeat them 500 times and somehow that makes them true, it's a very complicated process now, because we do have people listening to different cable networks, and you get alternative facts on those networks. And if you don't agree at least on the facts, then it's hard to have opinions about what you can do about them and what truth is. I mean, truth and keeping one's word mattered so much to Abraham Lincoln that even on the last day of his life, he had promised to go to the theater that night, and it was written in the newspapers that he was going to go. And as I said, he always had loved to go to the theater when things were tough, but now the war had come to an end. He had taken a long ride with Mary that afternoon. They talked about the possibility of being happy again, and he was talking with a whole bunch of his friends. He was having a great time in the White House, and he didn't want to go to the theater. But he said, I've given my word, and I must go to the theater. And of course, that's the night he dies. And so in a certain sense, even Lyndon Johnson, who was not telling the truth about Vietnam, was making much more rosy prognoses about the war's possibilities, he had to pay a price for that. And that was the resignation from running again, because the credibility gap developed, faith in his word bottomed out, and the support for the presidency bottomed out. The scary thing now is that one untruth follows another, and we don't catch up to the one, and so far a price isn't being paid for these things that are not being said. But again, that eventually that price will be paid. People know what is right and wrong. People know what is truth. People can see lies when they happen. And eventually they're going to make people pay for the consequences. I still hope. I still have optimism. Maybe it's just having been a Brooklyn Dodger fan and a Red Sox fan. You're waiting so long.
This is an unusual question in one sense. If you could sit down with one president, dead or alive, but only they and not you could talk, who would it be?
Oh, how could I not talk?
Yeah, well, if you can't answer that question, then assume you could talk.
Maybe I could just say a few words.
Yes, yes. Let's.
I think whoever I was working on in the time would be the person that I would want to talk to, obviously, because there'd be 1,000 questions I want to ask them about whatever they had done that I was writing about to see if I was getting it right. But if I could only choose one, I think it would just be Lincoln, and I think all I would say was 4 words: tell me a story. Because then he would come alive. It was said when he told stories that his whole body would be into it. He would smile. His whole demeanor would change. And then I would see him alive. I think that's what it would be, if I could at least say those 4 words. And then he could just keep entertaining me the rest of the time. And he'd come back to life. I'd love him to come back to life.
Actually, from your writing about him, I don't think you'd have to ask him to tell a story.
That may be right. I might just still...
Yeah, he just, Did your 4 leaders share the same understanding of power, where it comes from, and how to get it?
Wow, these are great questions. Lyndon Johnson probably earliest on understood how to get power. I think more than the others, actually. There's great stories told about him when he was even in college. When he goes to college, he decides, well, how do you get power? Well, you get close to people who have power. So he decides he wants to get to know the president of the college. So what does he do? He joins a janitorial staff, which all the people had to have some job or another. And he wanted to be assigned inside near the president's office, but unfortunately he's assigned outside. So he decides, I'm going to pick up more trash in the shortest number of time than anybody, so I make an impression, so I can get promoted to the inside janitorial staff. And he does that. Then he gets to the inside, and he asks to be assigned to mop the floor right outside the president's office. And he mops so well that the president notices him. And then the president starts talking to him, the president of the college. And then the next thing you know, he's in the president's office. The next thing you know, he's a clerk to the president. The next thing you know, he's running the president's office. And then he decides to use his powers in the president's office to get his best friend elected the student body president. So then he's actually running the school, from behind the throne. And he gets to Washington then as a legislative assistant to a new congressman who gets there. And he says even then, power. It's got a smell, it's got an odor. I can smell it now that I'm in Washington. All these congressmen and senators here, I'm going to be one of them someday. And then he gets into all the legislative secretaries to the congressman would be living in the same house, the Dodge House. So he decides, I have to figure out who knows the most, who could be my best mentor to tell me how this works, the House of Representatives. So he goes in the morning and he brushes his teeth 4 different times so he can see more people. And then he takes like 5 or 6 showers at night so he can see more people. And he keeps questioning them until he finds the person who's the best. And then somebody said by 6 months, he was the most green person when he entered it. He knew more than people who'd been there for 30 years. So he understood the levers of power. He knew how to use one to get something else. I think more than any of the others did right away. It's a skill. It's a skill. The rest of them obviously became leaders and using other kinds of skills and strengths to do that. But power itself, I think, was what Johnson understood. And then finally, as I say, that power got used for a purpose, and that was the important thing.
Yeah. How would you compare the divisions in our country today to those during the Civil War?
Well, clearly, the Civil War divisions, even leading up to the Civil War, are much more intense than ours, though there's a certain echo in things. For example, there weren't really many national newspapers at that time, so the way you got your news was to take a subscription to your party's newspaper. And because people were so interested in politics in those days, as I said, even people without much money would be taking a subscription to their party newspaper. So you'd only read the Whig newspaper, the Democratic newspaper, the Republican newspaper, and you would see absolute alternative facts in those newspapers. It was said that if Lincoln was in a debate with Douglas and reading the Republican newspaper, it might say he was so fantastic, he was so brilliant that he was carried out on the arms of his supporters. And then in the other paper, it might say something like, he was so terrible, he was embarrassed, he fell on the floor, and they had to drag him out of the room. So it wasn't quite as extreme as that, but that's what it was. But I think that the thing that struck me, I was thinking about this the other day, just in terms of the completely different reactions to the Kavanaugh hearings on the part of one party or the other party. And there was an incident that happened in the 1850s where a congressman from the South, from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, came onto the Senate floor and hit the Massachusetts Senator, Charles Sumner, over the head with a cane. And when Sumner tried to get up from the chair, he just squished him down even more so that he was very hurt. He was out for months and months and months. But the saddest thing that happened after that was the reaction from the South and the North was totally different. In the South, Preston Brooks was made a hero. He was presented with a golden cane, and all of a sudden a lot of people are carrying canes around hoping that they can hit somebody over the head. Whereas in the North, it mobilized the anti-slavery spirit to a great degree. People were in streets talking about this, and it actually strengthened the Republican Party. And so it led eventually to the Republican Party becoming the second party, absorbing the Whig Party, and to Lincoln becoming president. So things do have an echo in the past, but luckily they're not at the moment carrying guns around the Senate floor as they did in those days, and we haven't gone into the worst conflagration in our history, the Civil War, with 600,000 people dying.
We have time for one last question. One last question. In the introduction written by the Commonwealth Club, they mention your being the first woman to go into the Red Sox locker room. Tell us about that.
Well, what happened is that I used to go to spring training so that I could write articles about the Red Sox and bring my kids to spring training. Not that I really was a journalist, but that I became one for those purposes. And I wrote wonderfully fun articles, and it was great to bring my kids to spring training. So it happened to be there one year when the ruling came down from the courts. Somebody from Sports Illustrated, who I actually knew later, they brought a suit on her behalf to allow women into the locker room. So the owner of the Red Sox said, "Go in, you're here, we've just come down." So it wasn't as dramatic as one might seem it would be, because when I went in, none of them were there. So I didn't see any of them in their great buff outfits. Although my friend Beth was reminding me when we were talking about this before the locker room experience, that later I was able to get to see some buff guys. When Stephen Colbert had me on, the time before last, he had me carried out on the stage on a chaise lounge with 4 buff Lincolns, and they were all there. Their chests were all shiny. They had the beard and and they were wearing tiny little pants. And so maybe that's what I would have imagined they would have looked like. but I'll just so be it.
Thank you. Best-selling author of Leadership in Turbulent Times, our audience here in Santa Clara, and those of you joining us on the radio and the web. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, celebrating over 115 years, is adjourned.